Yeah, that's right, Brandis. Chicago could soon have its first majority Asian American ward. That's the hope of many community leaders who want to see Chinatown and the surrounding area included in a single ward as part of the city's once-a-decade remap. And they're calling for Asian American communities in Albany Park, West Ridge, and Uptown to stay together in their respective wards to ensure that their voices are heard. And joining us to talk about the remap process and Asian American political representation are Kathleen Yang Clayton, Clinical Associate Professor and Research Associate with UIC's Great Cities Institute, and Grace Pye, Executive Director of Asian Americans Advancing Justice. Thanks, both of you, for being here. Grace, I'll start with you. You're one of the groups advocating for a majority Asian American ward centered around Bridgeport and Chinatown. Why is it so important to have that kind of representation in the city?
Asian Americans are the fastest growing racial group and ethnic group in the US and also in Chicago and Illinois. We're nearly 7% of the population in Chicago, and we don't have a single majority Asian American ward in the city. I think it's time now to create that ward. The Census 2020 numbers show that it is possible to create a majority Asian American ward, and it would be really symbolic and significant to the entire Asian American community across the city to create a majority Asian American ward and to have the opportunity to elect a representative that reflects our community.
And Kathleen Yang Clayton, it's not just Chinatown, but there's significant Asian American populations around Uptown, Argyle, Westtown with Devon Avenue, Albany Park. What about representation for those communities?
Well, I mean, based on what I'm hearing from Grace, they're advocating to keep those communities at least whole so you don't actually split them during the remapping process. That's an important component of it. The other part of it is actually reaching out and registering and educating and mobilizing voters in our communities around policy issues that actually matter to them.
And Grace Pye, we've covered the remap fight here. African-American aldermen, Latino aldermen are kind of arm wrestling over how many majority wards that those groups should have. How much traction is this fight that you're waging getting among older people?
We're really excited about the momentum that we have built. I mean, just last week, I think Alderman Irvin on this show committed that the Black Caucus supports a majority Asian American ward and would include one in their proposed map. We haven't seen that map yet, but we are eagerly awaiting it. We recently got a commitment from the Latino Caucus that they would amend their map to include a majority Asian American ward, since their proposal fell short of a majority at, was in the high 40s in terms of percentage. So we're feeling really hopeful and optimistic about where things are headed.
Alderman Amaya Pawar was the last Asian American representative on City Council. He's been gone for a while. Kathleen Yang Clayton, what would be the day-to-day impact of having more Asian Americans on City Council or in Illinois government in general?
Well, I mean, so again, the representation piece is very important. I mean, one of the sort of common myths of Asian Americans, whether you're from India or from China or from Laos, is that we are perpetual foreigners. So just by the mere fact that our faces are in the halls of government or in public service is extremely meaningful. I just want to point out that, 1 out of 50, we're going to have one alderperson out of 50, which is great. And, coalitions are good. The other communities that can vote for their interests, again, still need to be educated and registered and mobilized around policy issues that they can connect with other neighbors to actually affect local change for their schools and for public safety and all that stuff.
All right, Grace Pye, there was fanfare when Theresa Ma was elected to the Illinois General Assembly around Chinatown. What other political representation is there for Asian Americans right now?
Well, since State Representative Theresa Ma's election, we've seen tremendous growth in the Asian American caucus in Springfield. We have 3 new state legislators in the House, that is state representatives that are Asian American that were elected last year. And we have an Asian American in the state Senate as well, our first ever South Asian state legislature and State Senator Ram Villabalam. So I think we have made progress at the state level. The city is far behind in that sense. The fact that we don't have any representation at the city, I think, is very clear.
And by the way, I think it's affected legislation. There was legislation Ma sponsored to teach the Chinese Exclusion Act and other subjects in Illinois public schools, so it has an impact that way too. Kathleen, you brought up the fact of it's not just representation, but it's getting Chicago's Asian American community mobilized and active. What are the barriers here to Asian Americans and being active in their community politically?
Sure. I mean, well, so first of all, like Asian Americans Advancing Justice and the coalition that they were with did pass legislation so that Asian American history can be taught in all of our schools. So that's profound. I mean, they haven't implemented it yet, but it's important for not just Asian Americans to know about our own history, but for other people to know that we've been around for a really long time. I mean, in terms of the growth, the other thing I just wanted to point out, sorry, is just Cook is very important, but there's been an amazing growth in Dupage and Lake counties, a lot. And so, you know, even though we are kind of fixated on Chicago right now, you know, the need statewide, or at least in the collars, to really think about language barriers. So that's the number one thing. 80% of Asian Americans, at least of 2018, I haven't looked at recent data, as of 2018, 80% of Asian Americans are English is not their first language. So if you think about knocking on doors, teaching people about civics, getting them to think about policy issues, having to do that in 5 different languages is very challenging.
And Kathleen Yang-Clayton, so you mentioned it's not just Cook County, but out in the collar counties, what are the areas right now that have seen the most robust growth in Asian Americans?
So, I mean, you know, so overall, right, there's about 800,000 Asian Americans. And, you know, what's really important for redistricting is actually look at citizen voting age populations. And again, because of the tremendous growth, it's important that we have numbers, but what actually counts are citizen voting age populations. And so about half of the Asian Americans in Illinois are citizens. So, you know, there's also the second issue, which is the need for pathways to citizenship. I mean, our communities are impacted by being undocumented, and especially during the pandemic, it was terrible. So, you know, out in the collar counties, I mean, you know, definitely like in metropolitan areas. So, you know, in Schaumburg, for example, if you haven't been out there, there is a vibrant, huge South Asian community. You know, so, and people think about the suburbs largely as being kind of monolithic or of one race, but aside from Asian Americans, Latinos, and even African Americans, the growth that those counties and those municipalities have seen and the resources that will be coming to them is largely based on immigrant and African American growth.
All right, certainly not an issue confined to the city, but to our entire region. And our thanks to Kathleen Yang-Clayton and Grace Pye. Thank you so much.